Patty, can you see the presentation?
And I can't see anything.
Of course not. Try to.
There you go. That's it.
Great. Okay. All right. So, welcome to the 2023 Recreational Trails Program Grant Administration Workshop. If you are here today, it means that your project was one of 7 non-motorized and motorized projects selected for funding from 30 applications, requesting over $5.8 million in requested funding. My name is Aiden Dicknight, the Outdoor Recreation Grants Planner at Missouri State Parks. And on this call this morning, we also have Lindsay Latham, the Section Chief of the Grants Management Section, and Patty Hubbard, who is our LWCF Planner, who will be monitoring the chat box and answering your questions. So what is the Recreational Trails Program, or RTP as we'll call it today? RTP is a federal pass-through grant program funded by the Federal Highway Administration. The program was developed in 1998 under the Transportation Equity Act for the 21st century. It is currently authorized under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Funding for this program comes from the Highway Trust Fund, specifically from a federal tax on fuel used for non-highway recreation. In Missouri, the program is administered by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, Division of State Parks, Grants Management Section staff. The purpose of this program is to provide funds to states to develop and maintain recreational trails and trail-related support facilities for both motorized and non-motorized trail uses. The purpose of today's project administration workshop is to ensure that you have the tools you need to effectively manage your grant project. Here you can see a list of items we are going to cover. We will start with your grant agreement and required forms, talk about notice to proceeds and a select number of laws and regulations that we expect you to comply with. We'll talk about maintaining your project file, procurement, reporting, reimbursement request, and closeout and stewardship responsibilities. Please note, we do expect you to comply with all of the requirements outlined in the Grant Administration Guide. So if we don't go over something here in the workshop, that does not mean you do not have to comply with it. The first component we will discuss is the Financial Assistance Agreement, or FAA. You should have received a copy of the FAA in an email. The FAA is between your organization and DNR. It is a signature of the responsible person for your organization. By signing the FAA, you are agreeing to complete the project within the specified time frame, to comply with all federal, state, and local requirements, to abide by any environmental commitments identified in the NEPA, to not incur costs for specific phases until you receive the notice to proceed for those phases, and to contact us immediately if the project scope changes. So this is what the FAA looks like. You can see the project sponsor information is on the top, the budget and project period, the project scope, and then you have my contact information at the bottom. Next, you'll have the funding and match amounts with attachments and amendment information, along with the federal award information. And then you will have the signature of the sponsors and DNR. There are 2 forms that you should have also received in an email. Please make sure both of these are filled out and returned. The vendor input form is very important to fill out now. This form allows you to be set up as a vendor with the state of Missouri. The account information that you provide will be the account where the funds will be electronically transferred at the time of reimbursement. The vendor input should not be sent to us. You must fax it or mail it to the highlighted address at the bottom of the page. This form has confidential information on it and our email is not secure. The Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, also known as the FFATA, of 2006 is an act of Congress that requires the full disclosure to the public of all entities or organizations receiving federal funds beginning in fiscal year 2007. The FFATA needs to be filled out by the project sponsor because you are the subrecipient of the federal funds. In addition to the FAA, the DNR terms and conditions of the grant are included in the Grant Administration Guide, either directly or by reference. For example, the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards are referenced in several places, but the entirety of the regulation is not printed in this guide. You can find a copy of these free online. The uniform guidance is especially helpful if you want to know what costs are eligible for reimbursement. In discussing the DNR terms and conditions, we are really going to zero in on a couple of terms that are pertinent to most all of the RTP projects. These are terms that are monitored by the department and in some cases require a notice to proceed, which is also known as an NTP. Specific regulations that we will cover today are NEPA and related environmental rules, the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970, Buy America Waiver and Requirements, and America with Disability Act. The formal notice to proceed letters or emails will be issued by GMS that provide approval to proceed with each specified phase of the project. These notices will be issued once all compliance requirements have been met. Depending on the scope of the project, the cost categories in the funding request, and the timing of compliance documentation submittals, a project sponsor may receive several notice proceeds throughout the life of the project. It is important to remember that you cannot begin any phase of your project until after receiving a notice to proceed for those particular phases of your project. For instance, a project sponsor will receive an initial notice to proceed letter authorizing expenses associated with planning, such as conducting the NEPA review and developing a preliminary project design, once a fully signed FAA has been received. A second notice to proceed letter would be issued for final design once GMS and Federal Highway staff review the required compliance documentation for NEPA determination and concur that the environmental review process has been completed. For projects that include acquisition of real property, another notice to proceed letter would be issued upon receipt of documentation demonstrating compliance with the Uniform Act. All projects will receive a notice to proceed prior to beginning any construction activities. It is important to remember that you are not authorized to begin final design, acquire real property, or begin any construction activities until after receiving a notice to proceed letter for those particular phases. Any costs incurred prior to receiving a notice to proceed will not be reimbursed. However, some costs incurred prior to receiving the notice to proceed may be used as match, such as planning, engineering, or environmental review costs, which can be up to 10% of the total grant request. Costs in these categories incurred up to 18 months prior to construction authorization, and notice to proceed may be used as match if they were identified in your budget table and budget narrative at the time of the application. Examples of planning costs include property appraisals and appraisal reviews for land acquisition and/or land donations. Examples of engineering costs include development of design and/or construction documents, and costs associated with the bidding process.
Yes. Do we not have audio? Is the TV muted?
Patty, can you mute them?
Yeah, mute.
Okay.
Examples of engineering costs include development of design and/or construction documents and costs associated with the bidding process, such as advertisement.
I think that makes
I can hear something. I just think we need to turn volume up, don't we?
Okay, they're muted. Sorry, guys. Such as advertisement and development of bid packets, etc. Examples of environmental review costs include costs associated with evaluations, such as archaeological surveys, environmental approvals, and applicable permits. Remember, you cannot start on this project until there is a fully signed FAA and we send you the notice to proceed with the NEPA and preliminary design. Phase 1, which is planning, engineering, and environmental, also referred to as the design phase, includes preliminary design, the preparation and submission of the NEPA determination packet, and final design. Preliminary design defines the general project location and design concepts. It identifies the project elements in relation to property boundaries and existing features and includes eligible pre-award planning and environmental costs as identified in the project sponsor's grant application. The environmental review process includes documentation of compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and other federal environmental laws, regulations, and executive orders, which must be provided as part of an authorized construction project under RTP. Most RTP projects will qualify as a categorical exclusion, or CE, under the NEPA. However, each project must be reviewed to assure that it does not have a significant impact on the environment. As part of the review, project sponsors are required to complete a NEPA determination form and provide concurrence documentation from various state and federal agencies in order for GMS and Federal Highways to determine if a project is classified as a CE or if it requires an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement under the NEPA. The NEPA determination form is provided in Appendix A, and steps for completing the NEPA review are provided in Sections 2. Later in the workshop, I will explain the process for completing the NEPA. Final design includes the preparation of final construction plans and specifications for the performance of construction work. All necessary permits, railroad, and utility certifications should be secured during the final design phase. Projects that do not include acquisition of real property may receive right-of-way approval in final design phase. GMS's approval of the project's procurement documents signifies the conclusion of the final design. Final design shall not proceed until NEPA approval is provided and a notice to proceed is received. Pages 37 to 40 of the guide outline the RTP program requirements for contracting and engineering services. All procurement of engineering and design services shall conform with the Brooks Act and RISMO, Chapter 8, Section 291, and in accordance with the DNR terms and conditions outlined in Appendix D. Every effort must be made to solicit bids from the minority business enterprises, MBE, and women business enterprises, WBE, to certify MeeBeWeeBee firms use the Missouri Office of Equal Opportunities MeeBeWeeBee search webpage. Project sponsors must inform all bidders that federal funds are being used in the project and all relevant federal, state, and local requirements apply. This information should be provided in the advertisement for bids. GMS must review the bid packet and advertisement for engineering services, and then GMS will issue a notice to proceed with advertisement. For procurement, the project sponsor must formally advertise through its website and for a minimum of 3 weeks in a local newspaper. This means 1 insertion per week for a total of 3 insertions over a 3-week period, with a written description of the proposed services requested and evaluate responding firms as follows. 1, the project sponsor shall list 3 highly qualified firms and shall then select the firm considered best qualified and capable of performing the desired work and negotiate a contract for the project with the firm selected. 2, for a basis for negotiations, the project sponsor shall prepare a written description of the scope of the proposed services. 3, if the project sponsor is unable to negotiate a satisfactory contract with the firm selected, negotiations with that firm shall be terminated. The project sponsor shall then undertake negotiations with the next most qualified selected firm. If there is a failing of accord with the second firm, negotiations with such firm shall be terminated. The project sponsor shall then undertake negotiations with the third qualified firm. 4, if the project sponsor is unable to negotiate a contract with any of the selected firms, the project sponsor shall reevaluate the necessary architectural, engineering, or land surveying services, including the scope and reasonable fee requirements, compile a list of qualified firms, and proceed in accordance with the provisions of Sections 8.285 and 8.291 RISMO. And 5, the provisions of Sections 8.285 to 8.291 RISMO shall not apply to any political subdivision which adopts a qualified base selection procedure that commensurates with state policy for the procurement of architectural, engineering, and land surveying services. Project sponsors must submit proof of the procurement process, which includes the affidavit of publication, a list of the top 3 contractors, and resume of selected contractor, including justification of why they were deemed the most qualified, to GMS for approval prior to signing a contract with the firm. After reviewing the procurement process, GMS will issue a notice to proceed with awarding a contract. The final contract must include the following forms: certification regarding debarment, suspension, and other responsibility matters, drug-free workplace requirements and lobbying, business entity, and e-verification. In 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act was signed into law. The NEPA established a national environmental policy focused on federal activities and the desire for a sustainable environment balanced with other essential needs of present and future generations of Americans. Federal agencies have to comply with the NEPA before they make final decisions about federal actions that could affect the environment. Thus, NEPA applies to a very wide range of federal actions that include, but are not limited to, federal construction projects, plans to manage and develop federally owned lands, and federal approvals on non-federal activities such as grants, license, and permits. NEPA is often referred to as an umbrella law because the NEPA review process encompasses multiple laws, executive orders, and regulations. The use of federal grant funding in these projects trigger the NEPA review process. In your Grant Administration Guide, Appendix A, you will find a copy of the NEPA determination form. Every project has to complete this form and submit it to GMS for approval. As you can see on this list, the NEPA form addresses impacts to a multitude of resources: historical, archaeological and cultural, threatened or endangered species, effects to parks under LWCF jurisdiction, etc. This form and the instructions start on page 6 in section 2 of the guide and are designed to help you comply with the NEPA in a step-by-step systematic way. Most RTP projects typically qualify as a categorical exclusion or a CE under the NEPA. CEs are actions that meet the definition contained in 40 CFR 1508.4 and based on past experience with similar actions do not involve significant environmental impacts. They are actions that do not induce significant impacts to planned growth or land use for the area, do not require the relocation of significant numbers of people, do not have a significant impact on any natural, cultural, recreational, historical, or other resources, do not involve significant air, noise, or water quality impacts, do not have significant impacts on travel patterns, and do not otherwise, either individually or cumulatively, have any significant environmental impacts. An environmental assessment, or EA, or environmental impact statement, EIS, will be required for a project that does not qualify as a CE. An EA is prepared for actions in which the significance of the environmental impact is not clearly established. If the EA finds a project has no significant impacts on the environment, a finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI, is issued. An environmental impact statement, an EIS, is prepared for projects where it is known that the action will have a significant effect on the environment. The EIS includes consideration of a range of reasonable alternatives, analyzes the potential impacts resulting from the alternatives, and issues a record of decision. The record of decision specifies the environmentally preferable alternative and identifies the measures that will be implemented to avoid, minimize, and compensate for environmental impacts. In order for GMS and Federal Highway staff to determine if your project qualifies as a CE, you must complete the NEPA determination form found in Appendix A. The form can also be filled out electronically as a fillable PDF, which is available online. Question 7 of the NEPA form asks about the project scope and footprint of the environmental review area. Make sure that you are giving a detailed description of the project, including depth and length of the trail, plus location and extent of tree removal. The environmental review area is the area established around your project within which any impacts to the environment is expected to occur from construction of the project and from any indirect impacts such as stormwater runoff, construction staging areas, and barrel locations. It is important to identify an area sufficiently large enough to encompass modifications to your project design because very minor design tweaks that occur within the area are very easy to review and environmentally clear versus design modifications that extend beyond your identified environmental review boundary. If any changes in the project scope, project limits, existing conditions, or pertaining regulations occur after the NEPA has been approved, contact GMS staff immediately as the NEPA determination will need to be reevaluated to ensure it is still accurate. For example, if after final design is completed and the trail is now outside the environmental review area, a NEPA determination will need to occur. Make sure to include a map that shows the project limits and environmental review area. Each section of the NEPA form will direct you to specific websites to help you answer the questions within that section. Make sure to include a color copy of the maps and reports you create from those websites. Within the guide, pages 7 to 32, you will see that we have provided photos of the websites to help you create the maps and reports. The NEPA review process requires that you coordinate with other federal and state agencies for their determination regarding the potential environmental and resource impacts of your project. You must attach determination documentation from these agencies to the NEPA determination form in order for GMS and federal highways to establish if your project is classified as a CE under the NEPA. For example, when you printed off the IPAC report, you might find that you have jurisdictional water in the project area. You will need to send a letter to the Corps to ask about the jurisdictional water and if permitting is required. A copy of the letter you sent, plus the reply from the Corps, should be included with the NEPA form. Other examples of maps and reports you will be required to submit with the NEPA form include the SHPO letter, the IPAC, Missouri Heritage, wetland map, floodplain map, hazardous waste map, farmland map, and public meeting information with census data. Tribal consultation is completed by the federal highways, so you do not need to reach out to the tribes. Here are a couple other sections and questions I want to bring to your attention. The Section 106 review pertains to historic preservation. Section 106 of National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to consider the effects on historic properties present in projects they carry out, approve, or fund. The State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, is the agency authorized for ensuring Section 106 compliance. To initiate a Section 106 review, submit a Section 106 project information form to SHPO. Instructions for completing and submitting the form are found on their website. You will also be required to submit topographic maps of the site, project plans. This should include project area size and depth you will be digging into the soil, and photos of any existing structures. Upon receipt of this information, the SHPO has 30 days by law to review and send you comments. I recommend that you submit the Section 106 review form first and then work on the rest of the NEPA while awaiting the agency approval. Question 13, under threatened and endangered species, asks you to address the impacts the project will have on threatened and endangered species, including information about their habitat and environment. On the IPAC and Missouri Heritage Report, you'll find a list of all the threatened and endangered species within the project area. You should list each species, where it is located, and why you will not be affecting it within the project area. Note in the slide that they tell us how many miles away their project site would be from the species habitat. Question 14, you will need to list commitments that you will incorporate to avoid impact. If you are not removing trees with your project, you should state, if any changes occur and tree removal is required, all work will cease until coordination with MDNR has occurred and approval to continue work has been given. If you are removing trees, you should state how many trees, species of trees, and size of trees you will be removing. For the impacted jurisdictional water section, this information will be found in the IPAC report and wetland mapper. Project sponsors are strongly encouraged to hire or consult with a professional who's qualified to identify the wetlands and other jurisdictional waters to determine if the project will have an impact on those resources. Many activities involving relatively minor impacts are authorized under nationwide permits, or NWPs. To find out if your project falls under an NWP, you will need to contact the Corps district office that oversees the district in which your project is located. Make sure to include a copy of all your communication with the NEPA form. In question 21, you will want to include when you contacted the Corps and when you received a reply, and then summarize the reply. For the remaining sections of the form, please follow the directions within your guide to help you answer the questions. Once you have completed the form, sign it and send the form along with all supporting documents to GMS. You may need to submit the NEPA in several emails, as we can only accept up to 7 megabytes of data per email. If GMS and Federal Highways concur that your project meets the requirements for a categorical exclusion, a notice to proceed letter will be sent to you. Remember, do not begin any phase of your project that requires a notice to proceed letter before receiving one from GMS.
Pardon?
In order for your project to remain active, you are strongly encouraged to complete and submit for approval your preliminary engineering environmental review, and final design within 6 months of signing the financial assistance agreement. You should begin the preliminary design of your project concurrently with the NEPA review process, since the design phase will identify potential impacts to resources and any required permits. However, federal regulations do not allow for final design to proceed until the project has received its NEPA notice to proceed. Once Phase 1 work has been approved by GMS and Federal Highways, the project sponsor must submit their first reimbursement request packet. This packet should include all costs associated with Phase 1 of the project. If your project budget included costs associated with the federal share, you will be reimbursed for eligible costs at the proportional rate indicated on your project agreement. If your project budget included only costs associated with the match, you will not be reimbursed at this phase, and the match will be applied to future phases of the project. You should still submit match documentation for reimbursement that do not include federal funds. If your project budget does not include any costs associated with this phase, no request for reimbursement will be accepted. The GMS will process all requests for reimbursement prior to authorization of the next phase of your project. Authorization of each phase seeking federal participation will require the approval of the Federal Highways prior to begin issuing a notice to proceed with the next phase. Phase 2 is the right-of-way. It is the project sponsor's responsibility to provide proof of right-of-way during their application submittal. For projects that include the acquisition of additional right-of-way as part of the project, project sponsors will be required to comply with the real property acquisition requirements in the RTP Project Administration Guide. Right-of-way includes the right to construct the project, whether that is the property where the project is located or any type of temporary construction agreement, and the right to maintain that property for a minimum of 25 years. So about right-of-way. The Recreational Trails Program prohibits condemnation of any kind of interest in property. Therefore, acquisition or lease of land or right-of-way easements on which to develop a trail project must be from a willing landowner. Additionally, acquisition of real property interest through easement or lease agreement must be for a period of at least 25 years. Provisions stated in the easement or lease agreement cannot be detrimental to the proposed recreational development. The easement or lease agreement must also state that it cannot be revoked at will by the landowner and that the land must be retained in public trail use for the duration of the easement or lease period. All acquisition of real property with RTP funds, whether through purchase, donation, easement, or lease, must conform with the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970, known as the Uniform Act. This act also applies to acquiring property with non-federal funds when the intent is to apply for RTP funds for the development of a trail project. In other words, a project sponsor cannot knowingly circumvent the federal law by acquiring real property with local funds and not follow the regulations of the act, and then apply for RTP funds at a later date to develop a trail or trailhead. The Uniform Act ensures that landowners are fully informed of their rights and are justly compensated when selling or leasing private property or selling and leasing any type of interest in the property, such as a trail easement or temporary construction easement. As part of this assurance, the Uniform Act requires an appraisal and an appraisal review to be performed. Additionally, the Act also covers the provision of relocation assistance to owners or tenants displaced by the acquisition. Section 3, starting on page 33 of the guide, you can see the specific procedures under the Uniform Act that you must follow when acquiring land with RTP funds. Appendix B provides a checklist of the documentation you are required to submit to GMS, as well as templates for the various letters and statements that are required. You must conduct a title search of the property to be acquired to determine ownership of the property, any liens or restrictions on the property, or any rights or interests held by others. It is recommended that a title company conduct the title search. Make initial contact with the landowner to see if the land might be available for sale or for donation, if the landowner would be willing to negotiate a permanent easement or right-of-way, or if the landowner would be willing to lease the property for the project. At this point, the price cannot be negotiated since it must be based on an appraisal. If the initial contact is made via telephone call, follow up with a letter that indicates notice of interest to the property. The notice of interest letter must include a statement of landowner rights, which is that a landowner has the right of just compensation for the property. A sample notice of interest letter is provided in Appendix B. Unless the project sponsor has their own written guidelines that fully incorporate compliance requirements of the Uniform Act and all applicable state and local requirements, sponsors are encouraged to enclose a copy of the Federal Highway Administration's booklet entitled Acquisition Acquiring Real Property for Federal and Federal Aid Programs and Projects. You need to determine whether or not the owners, any business, or any tenants on the property might be eligible for the relocation assistance. The landowner and any tenants must be informed of their relocation rights. It is recommended that both the owner and any tenants be given a copy of the Federal Highways booklet titled Relocation, Your Rights and Benefits as a Displaced Person under the Federal Relocation Assistance Program. A relocation plan will be required for any persons displaced by the acquisition of the property. Refer to the Federal Highways Relocations booklet for more information. Before negotiating a purchase price with the landowner, the real property to be acquired must be appraised. Have the property appraised by a licensed appraiser according to the Uniform Appraisal Standards of Federal Land Acquisitions, commonly referred to as the Yellow Book, with the landowner given the opportunity to accompany the appraiser. The appraiser must have a copy of the appraisal requirements, which are located on the web. The appraisal must then be reviewed by a state certified review appraiser. GMS does not provide appraisal services. For a list of certified appraisers, follow the link in the guide. Exceptions to the appraisal requirements include the following conditions: a waiver valuation when the fair market value is less than $10,000, if the acquisition of property is not complicated and a review of the available data suggests that the fair market value will likely be $10,000 or less, an appraisal is not required. Instead, a waiver valuation from a qualified person knowledgeable of the general market values in the project area will be acceptable. A sample waiver valuation has been provided in Appendix B. Note that the averaging of the final values of 2 or more appraisal reports to estimate the fair market value of a property is unacceptable and does not meet the requirements of the Uniform Act. An appraisal is also not required when the landowner is donating the property and releases the project sponsors from their obligation to appraise the property. However, if the value of the donated property is being used as a project sponsor's match, an appraisal or waiver valuation will still need to be conducted to determine the fair market value of the property in order to determine the match amount. Before initiating negotiations with the property owner, the project sponsor must establish an amount which they believe is just compensation for the real property. The amount cannot be less than the approved appraisal of the fair market value of the property and must take into account the value of the allowable damages or benefits to any remaining property. The project sponsor will then make a written offer to the owner to acquire the property for the full amount believed to be just compensation. The offer of just compensation must also include a written statement for the basis of the offer of just compensation. The statement must include the amount offered as just compensation, a description and location identification of the real property, and/or the interest in the real property to be acquired, identification of the buildings, structures, and other improvements which are included as part of the offer, and whether or not there are any other separately held ownerships in the property, such as tenant-owned improvements. The statement must indicate that these ownership interests are not included in this offer. In the case where the landowner is willing to donate the real property, an offer of just compensation and a statement of just compensation are not required. Instead, the landowner must sign a waiver of right to just compensation, which states that the landowner waives their rights to just compensation and agrees to donate the property or property interest. Appendix B provides a sample waiver of right to just compensation. Once the landowner has received the offer of just compensation and statement of just compensation, the owner must be given reasonable opportunity to consider the offer and present any additional information or material that the owner believes is relevant to determining the value of the property. The owner must also be given an opportunity to suggest modifications to the proposed terms and conditions of the purchase. The purchase price for the property may exceed the amount offered as just compensation when reasonable efforts to negotiate an agreement at the amount have failed and the project sponsor considers the higher price as being reasonable, prudent, and in the public interest. A detailed and well-documented statement on this difference, with all pertinent appraisal documents and a history of negotiations documenting discussions of price between the landowner and the sponsor, should be submitted. Once GMS has received your documentation, it will be submitted to the Federal Highways for their review and approval. Upon receipt of concurrence from Federal Highways, GMS will issue a notice to proceed letter to acquire the real property or property interest. It's important to remember that you are not authorized to take title to the property, even if it's a donation, until GMS and Federal Highway staff have reviewed all compliance documentation. The Federal Highways has authorized the project and you've received a notice to proceed letter from GMS. Failure to comply with this federal law may result in the termination of your project, as RTP funds cannot be used to construct on property that was not acquired in accordance with the federal acquisition laws. Once the property has been acquired, the deed and the declaration of deed restriction will need to be recorded with the recorder's office and a copy sent to GMS. As a reminder, if you have to request an appraisal for your project, please make sure to specifically ask for an appraisal that meets the Yellow Book standard or uniform appraisal standards for federal land acquisition. You have up to 6 months from the date you are authorized to begin Phase 2 to provide GMS staff the documentation showing compliance with the Uniform Act. Once the GMS receives your request for right-of-way approval, GMS will review the documentation and, if it complies with the program requirements, submit it to Federal Highways for approval. Once Federal Highways approves the right-of-way, you will be sent a letter authorizing you to acquire the property. Property should not be acquired prior to approval. The project sponsor will then submit proof of ownership/interest, recorded RTP easement, and a reimbursement request packet for Phase 2. Phase 2 costs shall include the cost for acquiring property by fee title or the use of property by permanent or temporary easement, and all eligible incidental costs, including appraisal fees, title searches, preparation of preliminary surveys, plats, and property descriptions. If your project budget included costs associated with the federal share, you will be reimbursed for eligible costs at the proportional rate indicated on your project agreement. If your project budget included any costs associated with the match, you will not be reimbursed at this phase, and the match will be applied to future phases of the project. If your project budget does not include any costs associated with this phase, no request for reimbursement will be accepted. The GMS will process all requests for reimbursement prior to authorization of the next phase of your project. Authorization of each phase seeking federal participation will require the approval of the Federal Highways prior to being issued a notice to proceed with the next phase. So now I'm going to ask if anyone would like to take a short break or if you would like to continue. Anything in the chat, Patty?
No, there's nothing in the chat. So I guess continue.
All right. Because they love hearing me talk. Please note, project sponsors are not authorized to begin any construction until Phase 1 and Phase 2 have been approved and the project sponsor has been issued a notice to proceed with Phase 3. When GMS receives the bid packet for construction and right-of-way is approved, this will indicate that you are ready to move into Phase 3 construction. GMS will work with Federal Highways to obligate the funds for construction. A notice to proceed with construction will not occur until the bid packet has been approved and the funds obligated with Federal Highways. Phase 3 construction. Approval to begin Phase 3 means that you are authorized to begin construction. Project sponsors must use their own documented procurement procedures, which reflect applicable federal, state, local, and tribal laws and regulations in addition to the requirements outlined in Section 4 on page 38 of the guide. Project sponsors are encouraged to pay close attention to the procurement requirements in this guide. Adequate supervision and inspections must be provided by the project sponsor to ensure projects are completed in conformance with design standards, construction contract documents, and plans and specifications. The final inspection and closeout documents in Appendix I signify the conclusion of the construction phase and the completion of the project. Phase 3 costs shall include eligible construction costs. Grantees are encouraged to submit reimbursements as they are invoiced. A portion of at least 10% of the recipient's final reimbursement will be withheld until the final closeout process has been approved. Projects with a federal award of $500,000 or less, the US DOT issued a public interest waiver for Buy America requirements effective 8/16/23 for specific projects of $500,000 or less, subject to the following limitations. The waiver is from Buy America requirements for de minimis costs and small grants to prepare for full compliance with the bill's new Made in America standards for construction materials. The public interest waiver of BABA's domestic preference is for projects funded under DOT administered financial assistance programs, including the Recreational Trails Program administered in Missouri by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources for iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials under a single financial assistance award, for which the total amount of federal financial assistance applied to the project through awards or subawards is below $500,000. The waiver is applicable only to awards that are obligated or subawards that are made on or after the effective date of August 16th, 23. Projects with a federal award greater than $500,000, all federal construction contracts must comply with the Buy America law. Buy America provisions are to be included in all bid documents. The bipartisan infrastructure law established Buy America requirements known as the Build America, Buy America. The act requires the following Buy America preference. All iron and steel used in the project are produced in the United States. All manufactured products used in the project are produced in the United States. And all construction materials are manufactured in the United States. Any iron or steel product permanently incorporated into a project must be made in the U.S. The BABA extends the application of Buy America to construction materials, which includes an article, material, or supply that is or consists primarily of non-ferrous metals, plastic and polymer-based products, including polyvinyl composite building materials and polymers used in fiber optic cables, glass, lumber, or drywall. Items excluded from construction materials include cement and cementitious materials, aggregates such as stone, sand, or gravel, or aggregate binding agents or additives. Asphalt concrete pavement mixes are typically composed of asphalt cement, a binding agent, and aggregates such as stones, sand, and gravel. The Certificate of Materials Origin forms are located in Appendix F and must be provided to the GMS staff before purchases can be made. As you begin designing your trail project, you must take into consideration the access needs of people with varying physical disabilities. Federal regulations regarding accessibility and outdoor recreation are under two separate statutes, the Americans with Disability Act, ADA, and the Architectural Barriers Act, ABA. The ADA is a broad federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. The law defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. The ADA has 5 main sections or titles, of which the relevant ones for this administration guide are Title II, which covers services and programs of state and local governments, and Title III, which cover public accommodations. Title II entities are non-federal public entities such as school districts, townships, cities, counties, and states. Most RTP project sponsors fall under this category, such as a municipal park and recreation department. Title II reads in part, no qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of such disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of services, programs, or activities of a public entity. Title III entities are private entities that provide public accommodations. Title III states that no individual may be discriminated against on the basis of disability with regards to the full and equal enjoyment of the facilities of any place of the public accommodation by any person who owns, leases, or operates a place of public accommodation. A place of public accommodation means a facility operated by a private entity whose operations affect commerce and fall within the particular categories, including most places of recreation, transportation, education, dining, commerce, and lodging. For example, trails open to the public, which a nonprofit land trust manages on private land via trail easement, would constitute a place of public accommodation. Trailhead amenities to provide guidance on how Title II and Title III entities should comply with ADA. The Department of Justice has issued the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. These design standards are minimum accessibility standards for buildings and other structures. As of March 15th, 2012, compliance with these regulations is required for any new construction and any alterations to existing facilities. The 2010 ADA design standards contain technical specifications for building and site elements common to trailheads, such as parking, accessible routes, ramps, drinking fountains, and restrooms. It also specifies how many accessibility features must be incorporated in each facility. Title II and Title III entities are required to provide accessible parking and accessible routes to connect users to any accessible recreation-related facilities that are subject to the 2010 ADA design standards. For projects that use RTP funding for the development of trailhead amenities, such as restrooms, parking areas, access routes, or etc., these facilities must meet ADA compliant. For your convenience, an accessibility checklist has been provided in Appendix G that provides the ADA design standards for the most common trailhead-related amenities, such as parking, access routes, restroom facilities, water fountains, hydrants, overlooks, etc. The accessibility checklist is also designed professional for further assistance to ensure ADA compliance. At the completion of your project, you are required to submit the checklist along with as-built facilities and an as-built site map in addition to other closeout documents to GMS staff. If you will be incorporating features or elements not listed on the accessibility checklist, consult a design professional or the DOJ's ADA standards manual to determine if accessibility standards are available. It may not be practical to implement accessibility standards for your trail development project, as opposed to a trailhead development project. There are several conditions or exceptions that may preclude making a trail accessible. For instance, a trail's intended user group may make it impossible to design it and construct a trail that is considered accessible. A mountain bike trail is a good example of this. Other conditions include the following: when existing terrain would make it impractical to design an ADA compliant trail, such as a trail that is steeply sloped and would require extensive cuts or fills that would be difficult to construct and maintain, or would be difficult to prevent erosion and other drainage issues from occurring. When prevailing construction practices would prohibit the ability to construct an ADA compliant trail. For instance, an area may only allow the use of hand tools for trail construction because of resource concerns or policy prohibitions, such as in a state designated wild area, which would make the construction of an accessible trail virtually impossible. When constructing an accessible trail would be fundamentally alter the setting or purpose of the area. For example, primitive trails in natural settings with little to no development or trails intended to provide a rugged experience would not be capable of being made accessible. When federal, state, or local laws would prevent the construction activities required to make a trail accessible because of impacts to a resource protected under the Endangered Species, National Historic Preservation, Wilderness, or National Environmental Policy Acts, or other federal, state, or local laws protecting significant resources. In addition, trail accessibility standards have not yet been developed and incorporated into the ADA for Title II and III entities, so the Department of Justice does not require local governments and private organizations to make their trails accessible. However, for the Recreational Trails Program, a project sponsor is strongly encouraged to incorporate accessibility standards where feasible. To this end, GMS staff have incorporated into the Grant Administration Guide a number of resources to help understand how ADA standards can be incorporated into trail design. For your convenience, the most common pedestrian trail accessibility standards from both the Access Board and Forest Service manuals have been added to Section 4 in the Accessibility Checklist in Appendix G. If you indicated on your project application that you intended to make your trail project, as opposed to a trailhead project, meet ADA guidelines, then you will need to complete the accessibility checklist and submit it along with an as-built map of your project to GMS when closing out your project. In March 2011, the Department of Justice issued regulations regarding the ADA and the use of other power-driven mobility devices, OPDMDs, on trails open to the public. These regulations cover trails managed by Title II and III entities. The regulations distinguish between wheelchairs and OPDMDs. A wheelchair is a device purposely designed for use by a person with a mobility impairment. A OPDMD, on the other hand, is a device not expressly designed for, but can be used by, a person with a mobility impairment. OPDMDs are any device or vehicles powered by batteries, fuel, or other engines that can be used by a person with a mobility impairment for the purpose of locomotion. This includes golf carts, segways, ATVs, ORVs, without regard to size, width, weight, or horsepower. A person who has a mobility impairment may use an OPDMD on public trails unless a prior assessment of that route or area has determined the use of the specific class of OPDMD the person is requested to use cannot be operated in that location without creating a substantial risk of serious harm to the immediate environment or natural or cultural resources, because it poses a safety risk to users, or because it poses a conflict with the federal land management laws and regulations. The assessment must demonstrate a thorough review of the following 5 assessment factors: the type, size, weight, dimension, and speed of the class of device, the facility's volume of pedestrian traffic, the facility's design and operational characteristics, whether legitimate safety requirements can be established to permit the safe operation of that specific class of OPDMDs, and, as outlined above, whether the use of the OPDMD creates a substantial risk of serious harm to the immediate environment or natural and cultural resources, or poses a conflict with federal land management laws and regulations. If, after completing an assessment, a trail manager determines that there are trails that cannot accommodate the use of certain types of OPDMDs because of the risk factors described above, the managing entity will then need to draft a written policy that establishes adequate reasons for banning or limiting OPDMDs use based on the above 5 assessment factors. If this applies to you, the Grant Administration Guide provides further details for how to ensure that your OPDMD policy meets the requirements of the RTP program. On page 37 of the RTP Guide are the procedures for contracting for services or materials. As discussed earlier, every effort must be made to solicit bids from meeby-weeby firms. All procurement and bid document requirements can be found in the guide starting on page 37. The following documentation must be included in the bidding documents: the Federal Highways 1273 form, the affidavit of compliance with the prevailing wage law, certification of non-segregated facilities, certification regarding debarment suspension and other responsibility matters, drug-free workplace requirements and lobbying, business entity, and e-verification. After receipt of the appropriate notice to proceed letters, no other approval is required from GMS staff for purchases or service contracts under $25,000, nor is a formal bid process required. We ask that you make every effort to solicit a fair number of bids or estimates to ensure that the most advantageous and cost-efficient contract is made for your project. You are not required to provide documentation of this procurement to GMS. However, you are required to maintain a copy for your records for filing for auditing purposes. When contracting for a service or purchase of materials of $25,000 or higher, bids must be solicited through a formally advertised sealed bid process. A copy of all bidding documents must be submitted to GMS for approval prior to advertising for bids. Construction plans must include a project map that labels areas and resources that need to be avoided during construction, as identified during the NEPA review. Similarly, construction specifications must include all environmental commitments indicated on the NEPA determination form. GMS staff will make every effort to review and approve your bid documents within 2 weeks of receiving. Note that GMS review of bids and contracts does not relieve you of the responsibility for full compliance with federal, state, and local regulations applicable to your project. Once a notice to proceed with advertisement has been received, the request for bids must be publicly advertised for a minimum of 3 weeks, 3 insertions in the paper, and a copy of the advertisement submitted to GMS as proof of compliance. The advertisement must include a statement that this is an equal opportunity bidding event, and maybe weeby firms are encouraged to respond. Project sponsors are required to advertise bidding opportunities in multiple publication and formats so that all interested contractors and suppliers have the opportunity to submit bids. Contracts must be awarded to the lowest responsive and responsible contractor or supplier who have the ability to perform successfully under the terms and conditions of the contract. Prior approval must be obtained from GMS before awarding the contract. When the project sponsor considers the lowest bidder unresponsive or not responsible, the next lowest bidder may be awarded the contract. If a contract is awarded to a bidder who is not the lowest bidder, a letter of justification for this action must be sent to GMS with the bid summary. Contractors must sign an affidavit of compliance with prevailing wage law, certification of non-segregated facilities, and certification regarding debarment, suspension, and other responsibility matters, drug-free workplace requirements, and lobbying. Copies of the bid tabulation summary sheet and all contracts must be submitted to GMS within 15 days after awarding the contract. For each bid packet that is prepared, you will be receiving a notice to proceed, one for advertising and one to award. After you've received your notice to proceed letters and have begun developing your project, you will be expected to keep GMS apprised of the status of your project through quarterly reports. The reports need to be submitted each quarter until the project is complete, using the quarterly reports form found in Appendix H. The form has also been provided as a fillable PDF. Quarters are January to March, April to June, July to September, and October to December of each calendar year. Submit your quarterly report by the end of the month following each quarter. Reports should be emailed to the contact information provided on page 4 of this guide. It is recommended that you establish some form of a reminder system to alert you when the reports are due. GMS staff may send you a friendly reminder if your quarterly report hasn't been submitted. Reimbursements may not be processed if quarterly reports are not submitted as required. Since we are starting your project in October, the first quarter you will need to submit for is October to December of 2023, which means your first quarterly report is due January 31st, 2024. In unusual circumstances, you may find that you need to amend an element of your project agreement. Amendments to your project agreement will require the Federal Highways approval to ensure your project's eligibility. A significant change in project scope may also require additional NEPA evaluation. The process for requesting amendments is outlined below. For a time extension, if you should be unable to complete your project by the end date of your project period because of extenuating or unusual circumstances beyond your control, you may request a time extension using the extension request in Appendix H. An electronic request form is also available online. Time extension requests must be made before your original project period expires to ensure funding remains available for your project. When reviewing your request, GMS staff may require additional information from you, such as a revised schedule for completing key milestones and an assurance that the project is still viable. The form should be emailed to the contact information provided on page 4 of this guide. Project scope changes, proposed changes to the project scope must be made in writing to GMS staff through email. GMS will in turn coordinate with the Federal Highway staff for their approval to ensure that the project eligibility remains valid. Include an explanation for why you cannot complete the project as originally approved, as well as justification for the proposed change. Approved project scopes may change the amount of grant reimbursement you receive. You must also provide documentation that the change in project scope does not conflict with the project scope described in the NEPA documentation. If the change is outside of what was cleared in the NEPA documentation or impact resources previously not impacted, then a reevaluation is needed and any appropriate coordination with resource agencies needs to be completed. A change in project budget often occurs when your project scope changes, so will your project budget. You can move up to 10% of your grant award between budget categories without GMS approval. Moving more than 10% of your grant award between budget categories requires GMS and Federal Highways approval. If you wish to move more than 10% of the grant funds in your budget, submit a request in writing to GMS, including the proposed new budget breakdown with the request. For project material budget changes, an example of a change order form is included in Appendix H. Adding new budget categories would likely constitute a change in the project scope and would require GMS and Federal Highways approval. If this is the case, a NEPA reevaluation may also be required, and documentation provided before any approval could be granted. After procurement is completed and contracts have been awarded, you have the opportunity to increase your total budget cost by 25%. That increase will then be divided by the matching share percentage on the FAA. You will need to email a letter to GMS stating why you are requesting an increase and submit a revised budget. For example, if your total project cost is $1.2 million and your percentage is 20.83 federal and 79.17 local match, if after bidding for your scope, the total is over that 1.2 million, you can ask for a budget increase of up to 25%. So that will change to $300,000, which breaks down to $62,490 added to the federal award and $237,510 added to the matching share. Project cancellation. In extreme circumstances, you may determine that your organization will be unable to complete your project and will need to cancel the project. Your project must be withdrawn prior to any reimbursements of grant funds and prior to signing any contracts. Once a partial reimbursement has been made, the project cannot be withdrawn. To withdraw a project, submit a written request to GMS. Additionally, Federal Highways may terminate a project at any time if it deems the project sponsor is not in compliance with the conditions of the project agreement. Section 5, page 45 of the RTP guide. For each phase of the project that has funds allocated, a reimbursement must be submitted before moving on to the next phase. Project sponsors are encouraged to submit reimbursements as they are invoiced, with a minimum reimbursements being submitted at least every 6 months. If you move on to a new phase and do not submit your cost for the prior phase, those costs will not be accepted. In other words, you cannot hold everything and do a one and done reimbursement. We don't do this because we love processing payments. We do this for a few reasons. One, it is required. Federal Highways will not allow GMS to obligate funds on your grant project except for the funds associated with whatever phase of the project you are in. This means that if you have costs associated with phase 1, we must first obligate those funds in the Federal Highways accounting system and give them a start date before those costs are eligible for reimbursement. At the end of phase 1, you will submit a request for reimbursement. We will pay it and Federal Highways will reimburse GMS. Then, if you are ready to move into phase 3, we will send a request to Federal Highways to have the phase 3 costs authorized. 2, a federal inactivity list. To stay off the federal inactivity list, at least one reimbursement must be submitted every 6 months. And 3, we want to catch the errors or mistakes early and not later. Reimbursement requests should be emailed to the address on page 4 of this guide. Reimbursement requests must include the following forms: a reimbursement statement provided in Appendix H. The reimbursement statement is the signed statement from the project sponsor formally requesting grant reimbursement. For each reimbursement statement submitted, indicate whether this is the first billing, second billing, or third, and so on under billing number. At the top of the form, the total cost for your project. This billing period must agree with the total of all invoices, labor, equipment, in-kind contributions, and donations shown on the reimbursement log form. The reimbursement log, found in Appendix H, documents the cost of your project and should reflect the list of eligible costs indicated in your budget table. Each item listed on the log must be supported by the appropriate documentation as outlined in the cost documentation section of the guide and must be dated within the billing period identified on the reimbursement statement. Billing periods cannot overlap with previous or subsequent billing periods, so pay close attention that the dates on invoices, receipts, etc. fall within the current billing period. You must also include a copy of any notice to proceeds issued by GMS that are relevant to the costs included in the log, such as the notice to proceed for contract compliance and the notice to proceed for real property acquisition as necessary. Individual and volunteer time record, also found in Appendix H. Use the time record to document the hourly rate of all force account, in-house employees, and all volunteer working on the project. The salaries of in-house staff are eligible for the project sponsor's match if they conform with 23 CFR 635 subpart B, which states that construction is in the right of way of a federally funded highway must be competitively bid unless the project sponsor can describe the project and the kind of work to be performed, the estimated costs, the estimated federal funds to be provided, and the reason or reasons that force account for the project is considered cost effective. The cost analysis must be approved by federal highways before force count labor can be used on a project within the right-of-way of a highway. For employees, use the individual and volunteer time record for each employee who works on an aspect of the project. Indicate the employee's hourly rate at the top of the form. The description of work must be tied directly to the project scope. Both the employee and their supervisor must sign the individual and volunteer time record. Copies of payroll checks must accompany the time record forms and reflect the dates indicated on the forms. Additionally, a copy of the employee's earning records, which show rate of pay, gross pay, and deductions for the pay period, must be included. A computer payroll register may be substituted for the earnings record. Fringe benefit reports must indicate the percentage each fringe benefit is of gross salary. For volunteers, the value of volunteer labor can also be used for the project sponsor's match. A volunteer's donated time should be valued at the minimum wage rate per hour unless the person is professionally skilled in the work being performed on the project. When this is the case, the wage rate this individual is normally paid for performing this service should be used. Use the individual and volunteer time record for each volunteer who works on an aspect of the project. The description of work must be tied directly to the project scope. Both the volunteer and the project manager must sign the individual and volunteer time record. The equipment use log is to track equipment use, whether it is in-house or donated use of equipment. On the equipment use log, use one form for each type of equipment used, noting the type of equipment, hours of use, and hourly rate. The equipment use log must be signed by the equipment operator and his or her supervisor. Use the Federal Emergency Management Agency FEMA schedule of equipment rates to determine the cost of operating various pieces of mechanized equipment. Documentation for costs should include an invoice, receipt, and proof of payment. Please make sure the invoice clearly indicates that it is for this project, that the cost was incurred during the reporting period of the grant, and paid within 30 days of the project end date. For donated supplies, make sure you have good documentation of the value of those. This would include an invoice or receipt from the company donating the materials. Proof of payment would include a copy of the front and back of the canceled check from the bank, EFT transaction log, a bank statement showing the check cleared the bank, or a credit card statement. All checks need to be written by the project sponsor list on the FAA. If materials are paid for by someone else, those materials will be considered a donation and will only qualify towards your matching share. This slide is to illustrate how the reimbursement forms work together. So this is where the project number and the billing status are located on the reimbursement statement. The reimbursement log, which is similar to a check register. This shows the billing cost incurred date versus the project period date. Do not use commas or number signs. This is a formatted form. Reimbursement totals should be used for the reimbursement statement and then split by the matching share percentage from the FAA. For the time record, the name of the employee should be the same as on the log. And the description use the budget categories that are listed on the budget narrative. For the equipment log, the description is equipment use, and the total from each page will add to the log as one line. Section 6, page 48 of the RTP guide. The date of completion is the date when all work is in a project is completed, or the date the project expires, whichever comes first. The project sponsor should submit the final reimbursement request, final inspection request, and all required project closeout documents within 60 days after the completion. GMS staff will conduct a final inspection of the project site using the as-built plan submitted by the project sponsor, the original project scope, and any subsequent amendments as aids in determining project compliance. Once the project is complete, a sign acknowledging the recreational trails program must be posted at the project site and should be placed at the entrance to a trailhead or trail. An acknowledgement sign must be maintained at the project site for at least 25 years. When the final inspection or ribbon cutting is scheduled, the GMS will provide a RTP sign for the recipient to install. The project closeout packet. Documents must be submitted as part of your project closeout packet include the following: Use the project closeout document checklist in Appendix I to ensure that you've submitted all required documentation. GMS staff must receive your project closeout packet within 60 days after the date of completion to ensure time to schedule an inspection, resolve any outstanding issues, and process your final reimbursement request. Final reimbursement request, you should use the reimbursement statement form provided in Appendix H, and under billing status, check the box marked final, include a reimbursement log, the relevant time and equipment use records, and all pertinent cost documentation as outlined in Section 5. A copy of the final inspection request form is provided in Appendix I. On the form, provide 3 potential dates when you or someone from your organization who is familiar with the project could meet with GMS staff for a final inspection. It's important that the proposed dates fall within a 30-day window following the submittal of your project closeout packet. This will give GMS time to contact you to schedule an inspection and you time to resolve any outstanding issues noted by the GMS during the inspection. Additionally, it will allow GMS time to process your final reimbursement. An as-built site map must be submitted showing the location of the project area and any trailhead trailside facilities. The plan must identify the work funded by the project, completion date, and boundaries of the site. The plan must also identify any accessible amenities and structures and should include a copy of the completed accessibility checklist. This plan will become a part of the permanent records maintained by GMS. It is also to be kept permanently in the project sponsor's public property records and available for public inspection with the project agreement. As-built plans showing evaluations, elevations, and floor plans of all structures and facilities must be submitted. The plans must also indicate the accessibility standards that were incorporated into the project. A copy of the completed accessibility checklist must also be included. A copy of the signpost construction certificate found in Appendix I must accompany the final reimbursement for development projects. This form is to be completed by the supervising architect or engineer on the project. If the project did not involve a contract architect or engineer, then the project sponsor's architect, engineer, or project manager should inspect the project and sign the post-construction certification. Control and tenure documentation. If not already submitted to GMS, copies of property titles, leases, easements, or appropriate documents must be submitted as part of the project's documentation. This includes copies of deeds or easements of real property acquired with RTP funds or real property donated as part of the project. This also includes the mandatory declaration of deed restriction that will record the 25-year stewardship requirement. The following is a sample declaration, which may be used as a guide to develop a document for recording in accordance with the RTP grant program requirements and RISMO 59.310. Missouri law for miscellaneous documents requires the document to be dated, signed, and notarized, and for the property description, including deed book and page number, to appear on the first page or to use a cover page with this information in accordance with the statutory requirements. In addition, each county may have additional requirements for recording real estate documents. You'll need to have the legal description of the trail corridor with the declaration of deed restriction. This is just showing the second page of the declaration of deed restriction. Here you can see what the final inspection request form looks like. At the bottom, you can see where you can select 3 dates and times for us to choose from. We'll come out to inspect the property to make sure it was built as proposed in the grant application and that you installed the mandatory signage and other features. So for record retention, for audit purposes, the project sponsor will need to retain financial records, supporting documents, environmental clearances, and all other records pertinent to the RTP grant for a period of 5 years, starting from the date of submission of the final payment request, per Section B of Appendix D. Refer to Section 4 for a list of documents you're required to maintain in your project file. However, remember to keep your property records for the stewardship period. Long-term stewardship responsibilities. Property developed with federal assistance must be properly operated and maintained for general public use. The site should appear attractive and inviting to the public. Proper sanitization and sanitary facilities should be maintained in accordance with applicable federal, state, and local standards. The site should be kept safe for public use. Buildings, roads, and other improvements should be kept in reasonable repair throughout their lifetime to prevent undue deterioration and to encourage public use. Evidence of vandalism should be repaired as quickly as possible. Completed projects will be inspected periodically by GMS staff. Copies of the inspection reports will be sent to the project sponsor. The purpose of these inspections is to ensure that the site is being used for the purpose intended and the site is attractive and properly maintained, and the area is accessible and open to the general public. All facilities developed with RTP funds must be operated and maintained in public use for 25 years. The facility should be kept open for general public use at reasonable hours and times of the year according to the type of area or facility. The project must be open to entry and use by all persons related of race, religion, color, sex, national origin, age, disability, or place of residence. The site cannot be restricted for use only by community or county residents. Project sponsors may impose reasonable limits on the type and extent of use of areas and facilities developed with RTP funds when such a limitation is necessary for maintenance or preservation. If fees are charged to use federally funded sites or facilities, the project sponsor must submit a complete schedule of all charges to be assessed for those using the facilities to GMS. If trails are partially funded by local tax revenues, a higher user fee may be charged to out-of-city or out-of-county residents. Where there is no charge for residents, but a fee is charged to non-residents, non-resident fees cannot exceed fees charged for residents at a comparable state or local public facility. Reservations, membership, or annual permit systems available to residents must also be available to non-residents, and the period of availability must be for the same. So with all of that, there are key takeaways are the notice to proceeds. Until you receive a specific notice to proceed, you are not authorized to move on to the next phase of your project. If you are ever in doubt, contact us. Reimbursements, you should submit the reimbursements as your invoice, but at a minimum of 6 months. And quarterly reports, make sure to set reminders for submission of reports to GMS. And this slide has my contact information with my phone number and my email, and Lindsay's contact information, along with the MSP grants at dnr.mo.gov. That will go to anyone in GMS, so we can all see that folder. So it will for sure get to someone. So now if there's any questions in the chat, Patty, or if anyone wants to come off mute and ask any questions.
Okay, so the one big question we had was with the Build America, Buy America, the 500,000, is that on the federal award or is that total project cost?
500,000, the new waiver is for federal award. So all RTP projects will fall under this because the maximum award that you guys can ask for is 250,000. And even with a 25% increase, you guys will not go over that threshold. However, we could potentially in the future have projects that do go over that threshold. And that's why that section is in there that still talks about Buy America further on. So to answer the question, you're under the waiver.
Okay. And then is there an estimate of when the 23 guide will be available for them to have?
Hopefully in the next week or two. So what happens is it has to get approved through legal and federal highways. And then once it's approved, it'll go to graphics, and graphics will upload it to our website. And so then once it's uploaded on our website, I will send an email out to everyone so that you guys can go and download it if you want, because it's a pretty large file. And then on that same website is where a lot of our forms are listed too. But I'll send out an email letting you guys know when it's uploaded.
Hayden, this is Chuck Souls with the City of Smithville. I had a couple questions. If we're already a vendor with the state, do you need us to fill out that vendor input ACH form?
Not if what you submitted with the state is where you want the money to go. Sometimes we have cities that have parks departments that want it specifically to go to their parks department. But if you're already a vendor with the state, then that's fine. You don't need to resubmit anything.
Okay, we had a previous grant about 4 years ago with the, I think it was LWCF, so I think it should be set up right, but we'll check.
Okay.
My other question was, you mentioned that we had 6 months to get our NEPA and preliminary engineering in.
Mhm.
So when but you don't want us to start until after we get the notice to proceed, which we
Mhm.
won't get until we get the FAA signed.
Mhm.
How long is that gonna take to turn around?
The FAA is so you guys receive the FAA,
Mm-hmm.
you sign the FAA, it comes back to the department signs it.
Yeah.
Once the department signs it, then the Fed, if you have phase one funds, then it has to go to the federal highways for signature. Your 6 months won't start until the date of that notice to proceed letter.
Okay. Okay. That was my question.
And so I'll send a notice to proceed letter that says you have the notice of award of this project and you have the notice to proceed with preliminary design and the NEPA. And the preliminary design is just that it's a preliminary design. It's not the bid documents or anything. It's just that first startup of the design to
Right.
help with the NEPA form.
Okay.
It's 6 months from that notice to proceed. And that's if you have phase one funds. If you don't have phase one funds, then there's not a there's not a reimbursement until phase three.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we had another question pop up in chat and it asks, will the phase one notice to proceed be issued after the FAA is signed?
I think I just answered that, but yeah, so once the FAA is signed, it depends on if there's a federal agreement that has to be signed too. But essentially, once I get the FAA and all the other documents that I need from you, you will get a notice to proceed and a notice of award from me. And then that's when you can start working on your NEPA and your preliminary design. I think Myra had her hand raised too.
It's Chuck and Myra, so you guys answer Chuck's questions.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you. Mhm.
Any other questions? Okay. I'll let you guys think about some more questions if you guys have any. Otherwise, I'm gonna. Oh, go ahead.
Value.
Okay.
Hi. That was a question I had. So you've sent us the agreement. We've
Yep.
sat in on this. Um, is it okay to announce this publicly?
Not until you get the notice to proceed of award. So you once the agreement is officially, so you signing the agreement is part of it. We have to sign the agreement. So once we sign the agreement,
Okay,
I will
so
I will send it back to you.
yeah, we'll have to have our mayor sign it.
Whoever your authorized representative was when you submitted your resolution
Mm-hmm.
for application, that's who will need to sign it. So if anyone is on the FAA wrong, send me an email and I will update it.
So sign it without a board.
Okay, okay, thank you.
But yeah, you can announce it once you get that notice of award, because that award letter will say, hey, you've been awarded this project.
Okay, so we had a question. If you could go over the salary matching with in-house labor again.
What do you mean? Salary in-house?
I think they're trying to figure out how to either document it or what they could use for the employees. Oh, if they are not hourly. If they're not an hourly employee, you should be able to figure out what they make per hour though.
So if they're city employees, then yeah, they should have an hourly rate. And so you'll document that for each individual person. They'll have one of those forms. If they're volunteer, then they'll go off of a minimum wage rate at the time, unless they are specifically skilled in that area. Does that answer your question?
She
Yes.
said yes.
If there's no more questions for now, I'm gonna let Brian Nevins from Federal Highways.
Hold on, we got one more question. One more question,
Okay.
sorry. Steve asked, and I can answer this.
Okay.
Steve, with your FAA, you have to send back your subrecipient form. That FFATA has to come back with your FAA. And you're already a vendor, so you don't need the vendor input form.
Okay, so I'm gonna let Brian Nevins with Federal Highways step on and see if he has anything to add, and then we'll see if there's any more questions. So, Brian.
Hey, Aiden, thank you. Great job. I just always like to emphasize at the end of these workshops, how important, it is to follow the federal requirements, and the purpose of this workshop is to inform everybody that, there's a process that needs to be followed. And, it's always better to ask questions than to proceed with something not knowing if you're doing something right. So, I mean, Aiden has always been great. You got Lindsay now. So, kind of the main, I guess, couple of things were that Aiden talked about, the inactive projects. We're kind of trying to reduce the number of inactive projects that we've been getting. So it's real important that if you have any costs that can be reimbursed, that get those vouchers submitted so that we can keep those projects up the inactive list. It's something that is monitored at the national level. So we don't want, a spotlight on Missouri for having too many of these projects inactive. And the Buy America is not so important anymore because nobody should really be going over that threshold. And
Victory.
yeah, and so, but I think that the inactive is probably the main area right now that we want to kind of focus on. But if anybody has any questions for me, I can try and answer those. But all the information that Aiden provided is very important, and these workshops are very thorough. Those notice to proceeds, those are kind of the things to look out for, that gives you the permission to move on with the next phase of your projects.
Does anyone have any questions for Brian? Nope. Okay. Does anyone have any other questions about anything we discussed today? Okay, so the main thing today with all of the attachments that I sent you guys yesterday would be to review the FAA, and if everything's okay, to sign it and to complete your FFATA and send it back to me. And then if you are not a vendor with the state, to fill that out and send it to the address at the bottom of that form. Once I get the signatures on the FAA, I will send it back to you guys. And you guys will get the notice to proceed with award / notice to proceed with the NEPA once I have the federal agreement signed with Brian, because I think that almost all of you or all of you have phase 1 money that you're requesting for federal funding. And so that means that I have to activate that phase 1 funding with Brian. Again, do not do anything until you receive those notice to proceeds. And if you have any questions about it, please contact me. And lastly, with reimbursements, there is no minimum amount to submit. So if it's $100, you can submit that to us. It does not matter. And those reimbursements are what keep you off that inactivity list. Okay, if no one has any questions, then that's all I have.
Great job.
Thanks, Brian. All right, well, you guys are welcome to log off if you don't have any questions. Otherwise, if you have questions, you guys can stay on and ask them. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys soon.
Good day.
Thanks. You too.